object to being recorded, then you might want to step out and watch it later. I'll let y'all make that decision for yourselves. And I'm going to step out now. Enjoy. Steve, I'm around if you need anything. All right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Catherine. And thanks everyone for joining in today. Today we're going to talk about Vashon rocks and the geologic history of our special island here. We're going to sort of take a field trip. We're going to go to the beach. We're going to see lots of rocks from actual Vashon beaches. And then we're going to step back and look at the big picture of the geologic evolution of Vashon. And if you have any questions, please use the chat function. And at the end of the talk, Mary will manage the questions. So feel free to ask any questions that pop up. But please wait until the end. Well, you can't ask any questions verbally because you're all muted. So let's start sharing. And so let's start by going to the beach. Everyone knows this is the north end of KVI. And we are going to take a little tour of the beach rocks. And I just wanted to start the first few minutes and show you the wide diversity of rocks that we have here on Vashon. On the left are pieces of the Earth's mantle that have been thrust up to the surface, mostly up in the San Juan Mountains, and got eroded during the last ice age and were transported to Vashon. And so just like all of us who traveled here, or our ancestor traveled here, we are immigrants, and they are immigrants to Vashon. But here they are on the beach, pieces of the Earth's mantle from 50 or 100 miles below the surface, now here on Vashon. It's just remarkable. On the right is a sample, a thin slice of nephrite jade that Bob Lane found. It's part of a subduction complex, and it's lit from the back. That's why you can see through it. But that's some of the jade that occurs here on Vashon beaches. We have fragments of the Silesia terrain here. If you dug down about 2,000 feet below Vashon, you would hit these rocks. But they occur at the surface up in the San Juan Mountains and all over the place in the Pacific Northwest. And these are pieces of a terrain called Silesia. They were formed about 50 million years ago in the Pacific Ocean in an oceanic plateau that's sort of like Hawaii is today. And they collided with North America about 45 million years ago. And these are all pieces of underwater submarine basalt lavas. And you can see the textures and the contorted lavas and breccias that form here. These rocks are just amazing. They're green and red, and they have big pieces of magma floating in them. They have all different types of alteration. The green color is due to chlorite, the mineral chlorite. We also have red basalt lavas. These are iron oxidized, and these were probably formed in a subaerial environment. And these could be any number of millions of years old. They could be part of the Columbia River basalt province that was formed in eastern Washington. They could be part of Cascade volcano lavas, or they could be pieces of oceanic crust that was thrust up onto the islands to the north. We also have pummices. These are samples of what we think are Mount Rainier eruptions from about 80,000 years ago. And they were found on the north end of Maury in Joe Van Oss's cliff parcels, right near some eagle nests. But they form layers in the sands on the beach, and they also sink. These don't float in water. They are just slightly heavier than water. But here we have on Vashon Island eruption products from Mount Rainier that formed 80,000 years ago. And at that time, they were transported by rivers and deposited here, we think. We're doing some research on these to really figure this out, our group at the Vashon Union of Geologists. So we'll know more in the next year or so. We also have these spotted rocks. They come in all different colors, reds and greens and grays and blacks. These are called porphyries because they have big crystals in a finer grain ground mass. The big white crystals are feldspars. And these used to be lavas or domes, like the dome that formed in Mount St. Helens 40 years ago after the eruption. And so they could be surface eruptions or they could be shallow eruptions, which gave the crystals time to grow. Here are some granites. These, everybody knows about granite. These are coarse-grained rocks, similar to the last igneous rocks that we just saw, except they cooled very slowly, so the crystals could grow really big. These granites formed in magma chambers underneath Cascade volcanoes in all probability. And you can see some of them down here at the bottom have different rocks associated with them. These are called xenoliths, the black things at the bottom of the, I guess I don't have a mouse to point to things. So those are little bits of the country rock that fell into the magma chamber and got cooled along with the granite. We also have mudstones and sandstones, sedimentary rocks, breccias, conglomerates, big chunks forming the pieces at the bottom. You can see the nice layering in these. These are probably formed in a marine environment, probably part of the subduction complex, because a lot of these are indurated and have been compressed, and some of them are even deformed. But these all started out as sedimentary sediments on the seafloor and got buried and cooked a bit. And then we have these gray and red and black and orange and yellow cherts. Chert is a really hard rock. It's made of silica, tiny little it's called cryptocrystalline silica. But these are amazing because they started out on the seafloor as radiolarian and diatom oozes. These little microscopic organisms that lived in the ocean settled out on the seafloor, and then as the sediments got buried, they turned into this chert, and then the silica went into solution and formed this vein network. You can see all the thin white veins. Those are all quartz veins. So this rock is almost entirely made of silica, the same as quartz, only tiny little grains. And the red color is due to a little bit of iron oxide, and the black is probably a little bit of organic matter that's mixed in with the chert. And believe it or not, we have 1.3 billion year old quartzites. These are metamorphic rocks that formed in the belt series of the Windermere supergroup up in British Columbia and got eroded and transported down here to Vashon. But 1.3 billion year old rocks right here on Vashon. So these are high grade metamorphic rocks. They were originally formed in a desert. They're pretty pure quartz sandstones. They're mostly brown and red because of a little bit of iron. And you can see quartz veins that have formed in some of these because of the metamorphism. But these are dense rocks. They've been buried probably by 5 miles or 10 miles of overburden before they were uplifted and eroded. So here's just an example of one of our shores. This is sandy shores, and you can see these cobbles just coat the surface. All these rocks didn't form right here on Vashon. They were all transported here by glaciers. And these glaciers formed, the most recent advance formed about 16 to 20,000 years ago when the Cordilleran ice sheet moved to the south, and what's called the Puget Lobe sheet moved right down what is now the Puget Lowlands. And you can see Vashon is the purple star. That's where we live. And you can see that the ice sheet made it all the way down to Olympia. we had about close to a kilometer of ice near Seattle and Vashon Island on top of us here. And as the ice sheet moves south, this is an ice sheet like Greenland or Antarctica. These were huge ice sheets. They got as thick as
signing out on my phone,
miles.
or am I signing out on the computer as well?
And so as they move south, they ripped up the rocks below.
Let's try it.
And they dragged them and put them on the ground as till and outwash. The till is the material in front of the glacier, and as the glacier overrode that material, it squished it and it deformed it and it compressed it. And then on top of the ice, you have rivers and streams carrying sediment, and that would form the outwash that you find down at the southern tip of Maury at the gravel pit. All the sands and gravels down there are outwash deposits. And on the right, you can see as the glacier retreated from 16,000 to 13,500 years ago, we had lakes form in front of the glacier. The ice dammed the water from getting out into the Pacific Ocean. And initially, as it receded on the bottom right, the glacial Lake Bretts, as it got far enough north of Seattle, there was a little opening, and you had this big spillway that allowed all the water from the lake to drain out into the Pacific. And since that time, the region has been rebounding, but it hasn't drained all of the water out, and we still have a few bits of the Puget Sound in the Salish Sea preserved here.
Still good?
Yeah, everything's good, thanks. So this Vashon advance was just the most recent ice age that we've experienced here on the planet and in the Pacific Northwest. On the left, we have several sections that show 6 major advances of glaciers. These are all separate ice ages. You can see one is about 15,000 years ago. Then there's a break, and we have the possession at about 70,000 years ago. And then there was another break and another advance about 200,000 years ago. Each one of these advances is caused by climate change. And on the right is a vertical time bar that starts at about 2.4 million years ago. And it shows how Earth's climate has varied in the last 2.4 million years. The blue bits are the cold times, and the red bits are the warm times, the interglacials. And you can see that right now we are moving from about 10,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age, to present day interglacial that we have now. And you can see that we're about as warm as we've been in the last 2 million years, but because of all the extra carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that we've been pumping, we're going to continue to get warm and probably get a lot warmer than we've experienced in possibly the last 100 million years. And so this just shows that the Earth goes through these cycles. These cycles are caused by Milankovitch cycles. A guy from Czechoslovakia discovered that the Earth's orbit varies systematically in its eccentricity, its obliquity, and its precession of its axis. And these periods are on the order of 100,000 years to 40,000 years. And each one of these cycles puts us into a new ice age. It's amazing. And in the future, we should go into another ice age based on the prediction of the orbital characteristics of our planet. But we're delaying that right now because of our activities on the planet. So if we look at Vashon now, let's take a closer look at the geology. On the left is a geologic map of Vashon that shows mostly glacial deposits. In orange is the outwash, mostly deposited as the last ice sheet receded and melted and moved north. The lavender color is the Vashon till, and the blue is the advanced outwash that forms as the glacier advances and moves south. So the first stuff to get deposited is the blue, and then the till is deposited, and on top of that is the recessional outwash. If you look on the right, you can see a elevation map that's colored by elevation. The white is the highest elevation and the greens are the lowest elevation. And you can see this is the new LiDAR map that was just acquired, a LiDAR data set a couple of years ago. And it shows the detailed topography and the ridges. Everyone knows about the ridges on Vashon. If you've ever driven on Cemetery Road or going east and west on Bank, you go up and down these long ridges, these north-south ridges. Those are all carved by the last ice advance. Those are mega grooves caused by moving ice in the last glacial advance. And on top of that, we see what the rivers have done. You can see the river valleys that have been carving out these big gullies. And on the coasts, you can see the product of landslides on the beaches that have formed. And so all of these processes combine to give us what we know as Vashon. So what causes these landslides? Well, it turns out that here's a nice little cross-section through one of our coastlines. And you can see somebody's house up on the top. The hard pan is another word for Vashon Till. And it's been turned into this hard pan because the ice compressed the till, and there's a lot of clay and silt, and it squeezed all the pore space out, and it almost turned it into concrete. Although it's not true concrete, you can still break it up if you try. But underneath is the outwash, the advanced outwash, and that's really permeable sand and gravel deposited by the rivers. And underneath the outwash is this impermeable Lawton clay. If you've ever walked along the beach near Point Robinson or near Winghaven, like the puppies are down here in the middle, you'll see this gray clay bed called the Lawton clay. The clay beds were deposited by glacial lakes that you saw the pictures of the glacial lakes earlier on, caused because the ice dammed the water from getting into the ocean, and it formed a big lake. And all the clay coming off of the ice settled out and formed this, it's about a 6-foot thick clay layer. On the right, you can see examples of the Vashon Till, big chunks of rock floating in this really fine, silty, sandy ground mass. That's the hard pan. So when the water flows through the outwash and it hits this impermeable Lawton clay, it goes sideways and it builds up pressure and it reduces the strength of the rock, and that's what causes all these landslides. So if you have Lawton clay near the beach, it's probable that you will have some landslides in the near term. So now let's step back and take a look at the big picture geologic history of Vashon. On the right top, you see a map showing elevation. And I've circled Vashon Island. You can barely see it down there. You can see all the volcanoes formed to the east on the Cascade Range. You can see the Olympic Peninsula, the highlands to the west. And you can see how the Puget Lowlands is this valley that goes all the way down south of Vashon. On the left, we have, and to the bottom, we have the same map that shows Vashon with the V near the top. And it shows the overall topography. You can see all the topographic features. You can see the channeled scablands over in eastern Washington, and then the Cascade Range and all the volcanoes. And then in blue, the blob that looks like a long hand and finger is the Silesia terrain I was telling you about. That's the bit of oceanic plateau that collided, and it forms the basement underneath us on Vashon, and a large portion of the Olympic Peninsula, and it goes all the way down to Portland and in western Oregon. So this is a huge plateau that collided about 45 million years ago and was added to the North American plate. To the left is the Cascadia Trench. This is the major plate boundary that we live nearby. This is our closest plate boundary. In fact, the closest plate boundary is the Cascadia Plate about 40 miles below us, because the same plate boundary is underneath us, as you'll see in the next slide. And so we have this series of volcanoes that are caused by the subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate, which shows the little arrow that shows the direction that it's moving at about the rate your fingernails grow, about 3 centimeters a year. This plate is moving to the northeast and colliding with North America and then getting subducted underneath it because it's denser than North America. The orange lines in the top map are faults that we'll be talking about. And you can see that Seattle and Tacoma are both bounded by these east-west faults. That's the Seattle fault near Seattle and the Tacoma fault near Tacoma. And Vashon is right between the two. So we live on a block that is being uplifted relative to Seattle and Tacoma. And Seattle and Tacoma form these huge basins that are to our north and south. And so these faults are caused by the subduction zone, but it's caused by the oblique movement of the Juan de Fuca plate against North America. And it causes this north-south compression that causes these faults to form and to get broken. So here's a similar map that now shows earthquakes that have happened in the last 1700 years or so. You might have been here during the Nisqually earthquake of 2001, and you would have felt that. If you were here in 1700, you would have felt a magnitude 9 earthquake that formed out on the plate boundary that resulted in a tsunami that made it all the way to Japan, and we know exactly what time it occurred because it was recorded in Japan, and they were able to model the time it took the tsunami to get from the Pacific Northwest. But this whole plate boundary moved about 6 meters during that earthquake in 1700. Luckily, these earthquakes don't happen very often. We have to wait another 300 years or so before the next one is expected based on the past history of these magnitude 9 earthquakes along this plate boundary. If you go to the west of the trench, you see the spreading ridge, and this is where the Pacific plate and the Juan de Fuca plate are moving apart from each other. And that's what's causing the Juan de Fuca plate to get subducted underneath North America. It also shows the volcanoes that form the Cascade Range from Mount Garibaldi up in Canada, Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, all the way down to Mount Lassen in California. That's all part of the subduction zone associated with the Juan de Fuca plate. So if we look at the same image, except we look at a block diagram, so now we're looking to sort of to the north, and we make a slice through just south near Mount Adams, south of Seattle. And you can see the oceanic plate is being subducted underneath the North American plate. And as it subducts, it releases water from the minerals, and that water causes the rocks in the orange oceanic asthenosphere to melt. And that's what causes the magma that eventually causes the volcanoes. So wherever you have this subduction with the right temperature, you can make volcanoes above a subduction zone. Not all subduction zones have volcanoes like this, though, so we're lucky that we have these. And it also shows where the trench occurs as the Juan de Fuca plate gets subducted underneath North America. And you can see how the Pacific plate is moving to the northwest, and eventually it gets subducted underneath the Aleutian Range up in Alaska and over in Russia. So we have 3 major plates involved here in the Pacific Northwest. The North American plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, and the Pacific plate. And here's an example of what happens when one of these volcanoes erupts. And 40 years ago on Monday is our anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens from May 18th, 1980, when this huge debris avalanche formed. There was an earthquake, magnitude 5 earthquake, that caused the north end to slide, and it was like lifting the top off of a beer bottle after you shake it. You had this huge eruption, and it blew off the top several hundred meters of the mountain, and it formed this eruption that lasted several days, and it dusted ash all over the Pacific Northwest. If you were here, you might remember that. So now let's look at a more detailed cross-section that shows the nature of the crust underneath Vashon. So V shows the position of Vashon. The green is the subducted Juan de Fuca plate. The yellow is what's called the accretionary assemblage. This is caused by all the sediments getting scraped off at the subduction zone, and it gets deformed and forms these metasedimentary rocks that we can find in the cobbles here on Vashon. You can see the Olympic Mountains there, and those are forming because of the subduction zone, because of the compression between the two plates, causing all this uplift and the mountain building. And then the Puget Sound is just to the right, with the Columbia River Basalt Group, the CRBG, forming on to the east. They were formed about 16 million years ago from fissures in Idaho and eastern Washington, and these lavas flowed all the way into the Pacific Ocean 16 million years ago. And they covered all of northern Oregon and Washington at the time. And you can still see them at the surface if you ever drive through Yakima and central and eastern Washington. So the Silesia terrain is the oceanic plateau that was subducted and accreted to North America about 45 million years ago. And you can see that it's this block that goes all the way down to the subduction zone. And then you can see the magmas forming to the east to form the high Cascade volcanoes. And then as you go east, there are these other accreted terrains that are now part of North America. So this is what, if we had a slice through the earth, this is what it would look like in a very cartoon form. If we want to look at a more precise way of the subsurface, this is actual data based on the distribution of earthquakes and seismic data. On the bottom is the same cross-section we saw before. The left is the west and the right is the east. And you can see the Olympic Mountains, and the V shows the position of Vashon, with the Seattle Basin shown to the right. And you can see the actual subduction zone with the Juan de Fuca plate getting subducted to the right and causing earthquakes. And all the little red dots are earthquakes that are either formed right at the plate boundary or in the upper plate. So the Nisqually earthquake was an upper plate earthquake from 2001, and that impacted Seattle to a great degree. And all the little red dots under the Seattle Basin are caused by the plate boundary effects in the upper plate. The cross-section to the top goes from south to north, so it's perpendicular, but we still see Vashon there. And this is important because it shows the tan Tacoma Basin to the left of the V and the tan Seattle Basin to the right of V. There's over 10 kilometers of sediment in these two basins. And so Vashon is this high block that is high because the blocks to the north and south move down because of these east-west faults, the Tacoma Fault and the Seattle Fault. And you can see they're shown there with a lot of black dots showing the position of earthquakes that have happened in the last 50 or 100 years. So lots of complex geology. The Juan de Fuca plate also forms an arch. If you look on the north-south cross-section. And so lots of complexity in the rocks underneath Vashon. And this map on the right shows a little more detail. The V shows the position of Vashon, and then you can see the Seattle Basin, SB, and Tacoma Basin, TB, to the north and south. You can see the Olympic Mountains, and then up to the north is another basin called the Everett Basin. So each of these basins are bounded by these east-west faults, the Seattle Fault SF and the Tacoma Fault TF, with Vashon formed along the Seattle Uplift. I don't know why they call it the Seattle Uplift. It should be called the Vashon Uplift because that's where it's located. Seattle's in a basin. So if you go to the King County groundwater protection website, you can download this cool map on the left, and it shows a little more detail on the rocks of Vashon, and it shows a cross-section of all of our aquifers. And if you go to the Washington DNR ecology site, you can see this cool map on the right that shows all of the faults in the area. And so the Seattle Fault is not just a single fault, it's a fault zone. There's a number of strands that have accommodated this uplift. And the Tacoma Fault is the same way. There's a lot of debate about where these faults are actually located. The Seattle Fault is a little better mapped. You can go out and study it in the field. However, the Tacoma Fault is more debatable, and it could be that the Tacoma Fault actually goes through Vashon. And so our group is in the process of studying it to see if it does go as far north as Vashon. But most people map it just south of Vashon, near Tacoma. So why do we have oceans and continents on our planet? It's sort of a yin-yang type thing. Why is there just the dichotomy between land and sea? Well, the answer is because of variable composition of the Earth. The crust of the Earth is of two types. There's oceanic crust and continental crust. And the continental crust tends to be lower density and thicker, whereas the oceanic crust is only about 6 kilometers thick. Continental crust on average is about 40 kilometers thick. And because the oceanic crust is thinner and it's denser, it's got a higher density, it sinks relative to the center of the Earth. And that's why the oceans have water in them. They're these big ocean basins because of the presence of denser, thinner oceanic crust underneath them. Underneath the crust is the mantle, and beneath the mantle is the liquid outer core and the solid inner core. The outer core is convecting rapidly. It's an iron nickel metal, and because of its convection, we have a magnetic field. Without a magnetic field, we would be subject to lots of skin cancer because of ultraviolet electrons penetrating our planet and atmosphere. But right now, the solar wind and all these particles are diverted from getting through our atmosphere because of our magnetic field. And then at the very middle, because the pressure is so great, the iron nickel is a solid. And the solid is the temperature of the surface of the sun in the very center of the Earth. It's amazing that the center of the Earth is white hot, just like the sun is. And so this just is an example of the Archimedes principle applied to our oceanic and continental crust, and it shows why the oceanic crust sinks and is lower in elevation than the thick continent. So, and the plates that we were talking about, this process of plate tectonics, it's because we have a thick lithosphere that's cold, strong, and rigid on the outside of the Earth. The lithosphere is really formed of the crust and the uppermost part of the mantle that is cold enough to be strong and rigid. Underneath the outer lithosphere is this asthenosphere, which is weak and plastic and hot. It's not totally molten though, like the outer core, but it does have little bits of magma where it melts due to various processes. And so you can see the temperature on the bottom ranges 25 degrees at the surface. In the upper mantle, it's about 2,000 degrees. And the core mantle boundary, the DD prime layer there, the orange, it's about 4,000 degrees centigrade. And at the very center of the Earth, it's 6,000 degrees centigrade. about 6,000 kilometers below the surface. So where are all these plates located? Well, this is the map of the 13 major plates. There's actually many hundreds of plates because there's a lot of smaller subplates that aren't shown here. But this shows the 13 major plates, and it shows that there are 3 types of plate boundaries. There are the subduction zones, the trenches where 2 plates collide. There are the spreading ridges where 2 plates are spreading apart from each other. And then there are the transform faults where, like the San Andreas, where 2 plates move sideways past one another. And you can see that some plates are all ocean, like the Pacific plate is all out in the ocean. The North American plate has a continental bit and a oceanic bit. Half of the North American plate goes all the way to the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. And then you pick up the Eurasian plate to the east, or the African plate on the other side of the spreading ridge. The biggest plate is the Pacific plate, and it's moving to the northwest. You can see how it's getting subducted underneath Alaska and Russia up in Kamchatka. It also gets subducted underneath the Philippine Sea Plate to form the Mariana Trench out in the middle of the Pacific. And it goes through New Zealand. It's got the Pacific Ring of Fire along it because of all the volcanoes associated with these subduction zones. And you can see that the Juan de Fuca plate is this tiny little one, this little purple plate. That's our nearest plate subduction zone, the plate that's being subducted. And it's the leftover of a much larger plate that used to form the east of the Pacific that was called the Farallon plate. And now the Cocos plate and the Juan de Fuca plate are the leftovers of that old Farallon plate. The Farallon existed back about 70 million years ago or so. So these plates are moving on the surface. They're moving at about the rate your fingernails grow, about 3 to 5 centimeters per year. And that accounts to many hundreds of kilometers every million years. So when you look at time in a geologic sense, a lot of things happen. And the total configuration of our planet has changed dramatically over hundreds of millions of years. How do we know where these plates are? We just look at maps of earthquakes. So here's on the top is a map of earthquakes in the last 100 years or so. And you can see that the plate boundaries are beautifully marked by these earthquakes. Biggest earthquakes occur on subduction zones. The largest earthquake ever is the 1960 Chile earthquake, magnitude 9.2. Close behind it was the 1968 Alaska earthquake, magnitude 9. The 1700 earthquake that hit the Pacific Northwest was just as big. And so these subduction zones can cause huge earthquakes. The earthquakes along the spreading ridges and the strike-slip faults are not as big because they don't have the large areas that get offset. You can also look at the distribution of volcanoes on the planet, and on the bottom is a map of all the historic volcanoes, and you can see a lot of these same plate boundaries are delineated by volcanoes. Not all of them. Some of the volcanoes occur within plates, and there's all sorts of weird processes going on, like Hawaii, where hotspot melting occurs in the upper mantle. The Canary Islands, there's a lot of other processes that can cause volcanoes besides subduction and seafloor spreading. So here's a map of the North America and South America, and it shows the age of oceanic crust. In red, if it's young, less than 50 million years, you can see the spreading center in yellow. And as you move away from the spreading center, the oceanic crust gets older and older, and it turns blue and then green. The oldest oceanic crust on Earth that's preserved is about 250 million years old over in the Mediterranean. And so all the oceanic crust that formed prior to that time has been destroyed and cycled back into the Earth's mantle. So we only see a little bit of the oceanic crust in terms of the geologic history. Some of it gets abducted on continents, and you can study it on the continents. And you can see the complex geology shown in North America and South America. But we're just showing the age of oceanic crust in the oceans. So speaking of time, let's go into deep time. We're used to thinking in years. Well, we're talking about 4.55 billion years when we talk about the age of the Earth. And here's a way of imaging time by making it a circle, sort of like a clock. So at the top is the formation of the Earth at 4.55 billion years ago. The first major era is called the Hadean. This is when the Earth was really hot. There was a magma ocean. There was no water on the planet. Water didn't condense until 4.2 billion years ago. So we didn't have any oceans until 4.2 billion years ago. No rain or anything, because it was too hot. It was too hot to condense. But then as we go forward in time, at about 4 billion years ago, the first bacteria formed, the first form of life, 4 billion years ago in these oceans. And then we had cyanobacteria and anoxic photosynthesis going on about 3.8 billion years ago. Nitrogen fixing bacteria formed about 3.2 billion years ago. And then we had this huge event called the Great Oxygenation Event about 2.4 billion years ago, when the first oxygen forming life forms occurred. And it's because of these microbiota that we have oxygen in the atmosphere. Without it, all the oxygen would form in the rocks, and we wouldn't have any oxygen to breathe. So that started about 2.4 billion years ago, and we're still in the Precambrian. We've moved out of the Archean. We're into what's called the Proterozoic, and a lot happened in the Proterozoic. 2.2 billion years ago, fungi formed. Mushrooms. They are so old, it's amazing. They've been around on the planet 2.2 billion years ago, and it's because of fungi that we have soil and we have this rich outer layer that forms the diverse plants and life forms that we have. Before fungi, we didn't have any kind of soil potential, and the Earth would have looked like some of the other planets in the solar system, like Mars and Venus, devoid of any kind of life. So we go forward in time, and we have multicellular life forming at 1.6 billion years ago. Mitochondria evolved at 1.45. The first single cell animals, 750 million years ago. And then right after that, the Earth experienced nearly 200 million years of snowball Earth, where the entire globe was covered by ice. The oceans were all frozen over, the continents were all frozen over. There was a very cold time because of the climate conditions and the atmospheric composition. There wasn't enough CO2 in the atmosphere to provide the greenhouse effect that we have today. And then following the snowball Earth, when the CO2 from volcanoes are thought to build up and we had enough heat absorbed in the atmosphere, we had land plants evolve about 700 million years ago. And from then on, we had this huge Cambrian explosion about 530 million years ago when life forms moved onto the continents. Then you know about the diverse reptiles, fish, all the mammals later on. The neat thing about these various changes that have happened in our environment is that sometimes they're caused by processes outside of our planet, like a huge meteorite might impact, like happened about 65 million years ago when Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, was struck by Chicxulub, and it killed the dinosaurs. That's one of those big red stars. There was also a large igneous province that formed about 200 million years ago, and also a 250 million years ago that changed the atmosphere and climate and created essentially a nuclear winter, but it's a volcanic winter. and it changed the life forms on the planet to a great degree. There were also extinction events in the Paleozoic, in the Ordovician and Devonian. So lots of evolution on the planet, caused by all sorts of processes. The plates are moving around, creating different environments. They put different continents near the poles or near the equator, where they're going to experience very different environments. So we've taken a look at a lot of different subjects here, and just to summarize this rock cycle, we've talked about sedimentary rocks that form by wind and ice and water, where rocks get eroded and then they're deposited on the surface. And as they get buried, they get exposed to conditions of higher temperature and pressure, and then they get recrystallized or metamorphosed. And these cause reactions to occur and new minerals to form. And these metamorphic rocks sometimes then get melted to form igneous rocks, to form the volcanoes that we know from Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier. And so this is really part of a cycle where igneous rocks get eroded and then formed in sediments, and then the sediments turn into metamorphic rocks, and all this happens over and over and over again. And that's what gives us these rich variety of rocks that we have here on Vashon. So I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning in today. Just so you know, we have the Vashon Union of Geologists, a group of about 25 of us. It's an informal group. We don't have any bylaws, but we do meet 3 or 4 times a year. And if you are a geologist and would like to join, let us know. Stay tuned for the Heritage Museum Wild Wonder exhibit that Bianca Perla and team are building. We're going to have a native rock garden there, and a lot of the rocks that you saw today will be on display in a native rock garden. They're all local rocks, and right next to the native plant garden that the Audubon is putting in, with descriptions of all the rocks and what they are. We also will be having a antique rock show coming up next February, like we've done the last 2 years. And so you're welcome to come to the library in February for that. So we're happy to answer any questions, and thanks for coming, and just let us know if you have some cool rocks to identify.
Steve, I just want everybody to know, if you have a question, just write it in the chat box and we'll get them to Steve. And while we're waiting for other people to type in, I have one for you. Early on, you talked about, you had a map of 2 different, or Vashon, and one was lavender and blue and orange. And it was really talking about the different tills and the different compositions of the soil. And I really missed, like, why our soil in Ellisport may be different than those in Sandy Shores or in another area of the island. Can you explain again why, even though the glacier went over and we have such different soil types?
Sure. So believe it or not, the rocks on Vashon are extremely rich in nutrients. So the sands and the clays and the silts, they have tiny little pieces of mica and feldspar and all sorts of minerals that have lots of nutrients. But people say that our soils are really barren and not really nutritious. Well, it turns out it's not because of the lack of minerals, it's because of the lack of organic matter. And so you need to add the organic matter to make our bedrock or our glacial deposits good for growing plants. So, it's only the presence of grasses and trees and things that die and eventually add these organic bits back into the soil that you can increase the productivity of the soil. But to answer your question about the different soil types, some of the soils down on Maury, near Sandy Shores, are extremely sandy. Near the gravel pit, that whole southern part of Maury is mostly outwash. Outwash is mostly sand and gravel, and it doesn't have a lot of fine clay, and it's not very good for soil in general. Even you'd have to add clay and organic matter to it. The rocks that we have in Ellisport are mostly till, Vashon till, and that has a lot of these nutrients like the clays and silt particles and the minerals that the plants need, as long as you add the organic matter to it. But the different colors that we had, I can go back to that slide.
No, not that one. Well, while you're looking, other people would, oh, I think you passed it. Some people want to know of a good geology book they could read.
Yeah, if you want, just send the senior, or you can send me an email and I'll be glad to give you, we have a frequently asked questions. Vashon Union of Geologists put together a fact sheet talking about all interesting questions on Vashon, and it's got a reading list with great resources. There's a book, The Geology of Washington, Field Geology of Washington, Roadside Geology of Washington, that was just published that has a lot of good information on it. But so, yeah, this shows the different rock types, the glacial deposits that we have on Vashon that you were talking about on the left.
Yeah, right.
And so in order for the Vashon till to be a good soil, though, you have to grind it up, and it has to be broken up and mixed with organics, because it's hard pan and it is dense, and you need a rock pick to break it up. So does that answer your question, Mary?
Yeah, Cheryl wants to know, in Upper Sandy Shores, it's so sandy, but they also have large rocks. Why the combo?
Okay, and that's because these rivers deposited these outwash gravels and cobbles, and it turns out on the beach, the waves and the tides wash all the fine stuff away, and you get left with the big rocks behind that can't get washed away as easily. We also have these big, we didn't talk about it, but we have these huge rocks called erratics, the glacial erratics. These are big chunks of rock that get transported on top of the glacier or within the glacier, and then when the ice melts, it just drops them wherever they want, and they get ended up, sometimes they're mixed with the till, sometimes they're in the outwash, sometimes they're just in the middle of the field. And you can see these on the beach. They're huge rocks. Now you got to be careful, because a lot of the big beach rocks were added by man as embankments to keep the shoreline stable. But a lot of the big rocks were deposited by the glaciers here.
Okay, Susie Murphy wants to know, is there a way you can trick her mind so she understands billions of years and millions of years for the length of time? While you're at it, can you explain to me trillions of dollars?
Yeah, deep time is amazing. So there is a way, and if Susie, I will send you this wonderful little metaphor where you look at a clock and you turn the seconds, when man has been on the planet, or seconds if 24 hours is the age of the earth. Or you could look at the age of the earth being a football field, and the last 2 millimeters are the length of time man has been on the planet. But yeah, deep time is a totally different concept, and it's really hard to fathom millions and billions of years. But we can quantify it with geology and with radiometric dating and all sorts of science. And so we can measure it, and it's there, and we just have to try to do the best we can to understand it. But I've got your email, and I will send you a great little series of metaphors for geologic time.
Well, Steve, you got a lot of thank yous from a lot of people. They like your slides, they like your talk, and that's all the questions for now.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye all.